Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 48 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Joining me today is John Capello, the founder and president of the Halyard Mission Foundation. John retired from the U.S. Air Force in 2014 as a lieutenant colonel after 24 years of service and more than 3,000 hours of flight time as a command pilot. John also served as the air attaché in Serbia and Israel. After retirement, he created the Halyard Mission Foundation, which commemorates the successful rescue of over 500 downed U.S. airmen who were stranded in German-occupied Serbia during World War II, and the role the Serbian people played in the success of the mission. But before we get into this discussion, I want to ask you, the listener, a question. Do you ever look around and wonder if anyone is listening in? If you're subscribed to this podcast, then the answer is probably yes. But how do you protect yourself from being overheard when that's the last thing that you want? How do you keep your conversations between you and the person in front of you and no one else? The answer is the ultrasonic speech protection jammers from tinytransmitters.com. When switched on, these jammers can effectively disable any microphones nearby. Likewise, if you're part of an agency or organization with unique needs, you can trust Tiny Transmitters to meet those needs with customized solutions designed to your specifications. Tiny Transmitters can embed the newest ultra-small transmitters in devices such as power strips, key fobs, cigarette packs, picture frames, and even in the walls of a cardboard box. Almost anything you can imagine, and probably a lot of things you haven't until now. Every order from Tiny Transmitters ships free anywhere in the US or Canada. What's more, you can now use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 to get 20% off your order. Go check it out now at tinytransmitters.com. That's tinytxs.com. John, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today about the mission and about the foundation.
Sure thing. I look forward to it. Thanks for having me.
So I had to ask you to begin with about yourself. It looks like your career took you to some very interesting places from what I understand. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like working as an attaché?
Sure thing. It was an amazing experience. It was something that I had wanted to do. I recall as a cadet at the Air Force Academy being exposed to the whole idea of the attaché work. I was very lucky to fly for the vast majority of my career. When it came time to do staff work, I competed for and was selected to go to Serbia first. And I had this honor to serve in two embassies, as you mentioned, in Belgrade, Serbia, and then in Tel Aviv, Israel. And it was a different experience. Both were extremely valuable, but as you might imagine, the relationship was different in each country, and that shaped the type of work that we did.
Yeah, I can imagine. It seems like two very different environments with very different political and military concerns along the way. Can you talk a little bit about what the training entailed to take on that job? Because I can't imagine that your pilot experience really prepared you for the type of, I guess it would be liaison and diplomatic or quasi-diplomatic relations that you were taking part in?
Absolutely. It was the responsibilities of an attaché are varied, widely varied. And it depends on the relationship that the United States has with the host country. So in one place, the military-to-military relationship might be very in-depth and very close, where in another place, it might be forming and growing, and in another place, it might be virtually non-existent. So you can imagine that the role and responsibility of the military liaison, which is your primary responsibility, might be different. So the training is very varied as well. We do a wide range of training. You can imagine language and culture, understanding what it means to work within the interagency process, working within an embassy. You know, as a pilot, I had very little experience working with the State Department or the FBI or Homeland Security or economic section in an embassy. So a big portion of the training was understanding what everybody else's roles and responsibilities were. And then, of course, you're the primary representative, the primary military representative for the ambassador. So in fact, you are a diplomat, and understanding those roles and responsibilities are something that we spent a lot of time learning about and understanding. The Army does a very good job, and they learned through experience and failure in some respects, deliberately building an attaché force, building a foreign area officer corps. And that's something that the Air Force was a little late in starting. However, the Air Force now does that. So you don't go straight from, say, the cockpit into an embassy or the cockpit into a staff tour. They deliberately work to during your career. So it's a much better process now.
That's good. So it was a better process when you took part in it, or after your experience? I
would argue that we continue to learn and apply those very important lessons to the deliberate planning and training of attachés now.
Of course, that makes perfect sense. Can you talk about what maybe like a typical day would be for you as an attaché in this embassy? It doesn't sound like either of the places that you were at were developing countries, but did you experience any level of danger, a terrorist threat to the embassy, anything like that? Any big successes that you're able to talk about at all?
Well, there is no really a typical day. That's what was so interesting and was so amazing about that experience, is that the experience varied from day to day to week. And I'll just give you a couple examples. You know, the relationship between the United States and Serbia is one continues to form, continues to grow. The relationship between the United States and Israel is a well-developed relationship and goes very much in depth. The military-to-military relationship is extremely diverse and in depth. And so you can imagine that, for example, just say acquisition of weapon systems. That's one of the responsibilities, assisting in that process. So the Israelis were competing to purchase the F-35, which was a NATO program. Mostly NATO countries were doing it, and they were the first non-NATO country to obtain that weapon system. So you might imagine that the coordination and the learning process was extremely complicated and very detailed. Whereas with the Serbs, we were doing familiarization programs and we were beginning to do mill-to-mill exchanges. So it was at a different level, but it's certainly no less important, because our mill-to-mill relationship with Serbia was important in building interoperability, in building confidence, and in building the ability to work together to continue to improve security and stability in the Balkan region.
That makes sense. I can see that being a bigger challenge, and I'm speculating here when I say this, but I can also imagine that that's a place where you have an option or you have the opportunity to really impact international relations in a way that you're falling into a very well-oiled machine in the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, whereas maybe you have a opportunity to be very impactful in both countries' relationships going forward. Would that be an accurate assessment?
It is. Look, one of the things that was fascinating is that we had, as you might imagine, in Israel, we had high-level visitors come to Israel frequently, and so we were often tasked with briefing, with sitting in on meetings. So I sat in on meetings with Prime Minister, with the President, and being able to see that process in action is really a great honor and a privilege. Now, that's not to say that we didn't have the same type of situation in Serbia. At the end of the day, when something was going on in that country, our decision makers, whether it be in the Department of Defense, the State Department, or the executive branch, would reach out to the embassies to get answers, because we were closest to the situation, and they sought our inputs often.
Yeah, of course, you want to talk to somebody who's on the ground and can see what's happening right there. So, John, you mentioned earlier that you were a pilot, of course, and that then you were acting in a diplomatic role, working with the ambassador. But is there also an element of intelligence collection that goes along with being an attaché in an embassy?
Well, there is, and the interesting thing about that question is, we still bandy about the moniker spy a lot when we talk about defense attachés, and I think that's a little bit of a remnant of the Cold War. So the idea of spying directly like that, I think is just a little outdated. Again, I always stress to my hosts that they wanted me to be the best expert, the utmost expert about their country and their military, because at the end of the day, when leadership in the United States had questions, they would reach out to us. They wanted to know what was going on the ground, and having that information, it wasn't a requirement for me to crawl around on my belly and take pictures of, and count the number of tanks. What was important is that I understood what was going on in that country, had a good relationship with my counterparts, had open lines of communication, and so that we could answer any and all questions that came from Washington.
That makes perfect sense, and that's a great way to kind of flip it around a little bit and make it clear, what your motives are, and why it's to their benefit for you to be asking a lot of questions and finding out as much as you can. That's a really good way to put a spin on it that is very appealing to, I guess you call them the host nation in this case.
Yes, I think it's important for both our interests. I mean, countries act in their interest, of course. The United States is no different than any of our partners. And when you couch it in those terms, that we have shared interests, and those interests are, very open communications, this way there's no room for error, if at all possible. And I found that approach to work well. Now, these were permissive and semi-permissive environments. I never worked in North Korea or the Soviet Union, so of course the situation in those types of environments would be different.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I'm sure that there is. Well, yeah, we know for a fact that there is an element of danger and risk there, certainly. So one last question about this, John. I have a lot of listeners who are members of the military, are going to join soon. Is there any advice you can give for anybody that thinks they might like to pursue the career path, and become an attaché at some point?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a career path within each of the services now, whether you call it foreign area officer or some other title. It's a path that prepares people to act in the international environment. And it's not just attachés. There's staff positions on NATO staff, say, on European Command, on the COCOM staffs. And so preparation to go down that career path is important. Language capabilities, of course, are very important. Having a good understanding of current events and history, those things are all important. And I think will play into the decision-making process should you choose to pursue that career path.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm sure they'll appreciate that. So after you spent 24 years in the service, you retired, and like we talked about, you served in Serbia, and you eventually created this foundation, the Halyard Foundation. Can you talk about what led you to create the Halyard Foundation in the first place?
Yeah, that story started when the first week I was in Serbia, actually, in 2007. I served at the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade from 2007 to 2010. And that first week that I was there is when I learned about this rescue mission. I had some Serbian TV producers, approach me for information concerning the Ploesti raids, the raids against the Ploesti oil fields during the Second World War. And they explained to me that they wanted that information because they were producing a documentary about a rescue of American airmen. As an American airman, I knew the history of the Ploesti raids and how dangerous, how hazardous those missions were, but I didn't really know about this rescue. And when they told me about it, I was intrigued, and I asked them for more details, and I particularly asked them to take me to one of the airfields where this rescue mission took place. And they did so. A few weeks later, we drove down to a village south of Belgrade. My expectations were I'd see a potato field, I'd meet a few villagers, and maybe we'd have a drink and chat. But when I got there, I saw what greeted me was about 40 or 50 villagers, a Serbian flag and an American flag. And I understood how important this story was for them, how this story that I was a little embarrassed, I knew nothing about, the rescue, that most Americans don't know anything about, how important it was for them. And I kind of was committed at that point to do what I could to tell the story. And so that's where my interest and motivation came. That's when it started. But I wasn't able to start the foundation until I left government service, and that started in about 2015.
Wow. So this was 2007, and you were greeted by all these people to talk about this mission that happened. At that point, it was over 60 years in the past, right? And it was still in the forefronts of their mind in some ways?
That's exactly right. For the relatives, these were the folks, the sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters of Serbs that assisted the American airmen. So I actually met a few at that time. There were a number of Serbs that were still alive that assisted American airmen, and they told me many fascinating stories about assisting the Americans, how the Americans dropped in literally out of the sky upon them, and their efforts to assist them, to keep them away from the Germans, to protect them, to feed them. You might imagine that story was extremely important to them.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing that it's still there because, I hate to say it, but for Americans, when we think about World War II, I don't think that battleground Serbia is the first place that comes to mind, but it was, of course, it's so important to the people who lived through it there and the American involvement there. That's really impressive.
No, it's a good point. The Balkans, the war in the Balkans is probably one of the lesser studied, lesser known aspects of the war. Everybody knows about Normandy. We talk about the invasion of Italy, the Eastern Front, but the Balkans is not something that is discussed as frequently.
Very true, very true. But fortunately, that's what we're here to do today. So people are going to learn something from this, I hope. So you mentioned the Ploesti raids earlier and how it sounds like that was a standard part of your curriculum in the Air Force. Can you talk about what that was for people who have not been through that and who are not familiar with it?
Sure. And you're right. I mean, listen, the raids against Ploesti oil fields were one of the main priorities. When the Allies when we invaded into Italy, we established bomber bases around Bari and Brindisi on the east coast of the Italian boot. And we used those bases to attack targets throughout Southeast Europe. It was 15th Air Force that was established in Bari. And from those bases, again, we attacked targets. One of the most important targets were the Ploesti oil fields in Ploesti, Romania. And those fields provided the Nazi war machine with over 30% of their oil and lubricants. So they were extremely important for the German war effort, and they were very, very heavily defended. And the losses against those targets were high. So you could imagine a B-17 or B-24 that were used to fly the missions. Each of those aircraft has 10 airmen. And so one aircraft downed would be 10 lives lost, or one aircraft damaged. Those are 10 individuals that are now escaping and evading behind enemy lines. You'd have missions where 60 aircraft were lost in a day. So as an airman, an American airman, that was something that was part of my heritage. I knew how dangerous those missions were. And most people don't understand how brutal the air war over Europe was. 15th Air Force alone lost over 3,300 aircraft.
Oh my gosh, no, I did not know that.
3,300 aircraft, over 21,000 airmen were lost. That's wounded, missing in action, wounded, but 21,000 airmen. 8th Air Force, which was flying out of England, people know a little bit more about that. They were flying missions into Germany, directly into Germany. They lost more airmen than all the Marines that were lost in the Pacific during the whole war.
Wow.
So the air war over Europe was brutal. It was absolutely brutal.
Yeah, the scope of that war, even so many years afterwards, it still boggles the mind, honestly. It was truly a world war.
That's true.
So you said that up to 60 planes would be lost in a single day. So you're talking about hundreds of dead or wounded or missing or captured. I'm assuming this potentially we're talking about like dozens or scores of parachutes sinking to the earth from all these aircraft getting shot down from a single daily raid. So how many airmen ended up on the ground in Serbia?
Well, if you look at the route of flight from where Bari is, you go anywhere over Southeast Europe, but particularly to Ploesti, you see that route of flight took you pretty much over Yugoslavia and at the heart of Yugoslavia, Serbia. So there were hundreds of airmen missing. And initially, the 15th Air Force commander didn't understand how many it was. He knew that aircraft were not returning, and he wasn't sure if these airmen were dead, if they were captured. I mean, there were well over 1,000 airmen that were captured around the Ploesti fields themselves. So they were captured by the Germans. So that's a whole nother story, Operation Reunion. But there was not an understanding of exactly how many airmen and where they were. And that's the key, where they were, because you might imagine that they were spread out over a wide area. And when we understood that a lot of them were stuck in Serbia, we sent a few missions there, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was, of course, the precursor to both the CIA and Special Operations. They were, in fact, the intelligence arm and the Special Operations arm of the U.S. military during the Second World War. But when they understood, when General Twining, commander of 15th Air Force, understood how many airmen were missing, he sent 2 missions to coordinate and to understand exactly how many airmen were missing. And so the thought was there would be 100 or 120. But when we talked to one of the OSS agents we had the pleasure to meet, the honor to meet, he explained, once we sent the mission in, there was an understanding that there were close to 500 Americans that were accounted for. So that changed the dynamic. And General Twining understood they needed to send some sort of a rescue mission to get these guys back.
So these guys, they're not going to be broken out of a POW camp or anything. They're hiding out with the locals, like just hundreds of airmen are hiding out throughout the area. Is that correct? That's right.
So you might imagine, though, that they all didn't parachute and land in the same place at the same time. So this occurred over a period of time. In January 44, late 1943, the mission started to increase as we had established the bases in Italy. So the bombing missions increased, and that's when we started to, the losses started to occur there. So you'd have one aircraft, say, land in one area, but those guys were spread out, as you can imagine, over a distance too. So all 10 guys didn't necessarily land in the same space. Some of them were captured by the Germans. Some of them were collected. It was a race on the ground. The Germans were trying to capture the pilots, and the Serbian people, the Chetnik forces, the guerrilla forces, were trying to collect them and then protect them. And then once they did collect them, they understood that they had to protect them and care for them at the same time. So they spread them out over a distance in the area that they controlled. They put 2 or 3 in one place, 5 or 6 in another place, and they relied on the goodwill and the assistance of the Serbian people to do that.
Yeah, that's incredible how just average people stepped up, because I would assume that they're putting themselves at a lot of risk of discovery. It's not just that these airmen are going to be taken away. I mean, I'm sure that the villagers would probably suffer something at the hands of the occupying Germans if they're found. But nevertheless, it wasn't just a few families, it doesn't sound like, but I assume hundreds of families took in hundreds of these airmen.
Absolutely. And that's actually a very important point, is that the German occupation of Serbia was brutal. You might know this, that if you wounded one German, they would execute 50 villagers or 50 civilians.
Oh my
gosh. If you killed a German, they would execute 100. I visited a monument in South Serbia, the city of Capello, where there's a monument to 3,000 people that were killed in one day.
Wow.
3,000,
wow.
Right? Just civilians that were executed. So, right, imagine if the Germans caught you hiding an American, hiding the enemy. Not only would they kill you, they'd wipe out your family and potentially the village. So you're absolutely right. They were putting themselves at great risk.
Incredible bravery there from everyday people that didn't sign up. They didn't enlist. They weren't going off to fight for their country. The war came to them, and they did the right thing. That's incredible.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. This mission was an amazing mission just from a military history perspective. I mean, think about it. This was conducted under the enemy nose, without being detected, without a single loss over the period of 5 months, right? So from a military perspective, an amazing mission, but it's more than just the mission, right? It's more than just the story of a military operation. It's the story of courage and honor and sacrifice, really, of these individuals. And that's something I've learned over this time. Again, had the pleasure and honor to meet both airmen, the Serbs that rescued them, and their families, that the sacrifices that they made. Think about the airmen that climbed into those aircraft every day, knowing how dangerous, right? Knowing how heavily defended the targets were, and that they might not come back.
It's really something. It's really something. So, John, once the mission got underway, they determined that there was a need for it. How did they select the people, and how many did they select for this mission on the ground?
So as we said, the understanding that so many Americans were behind enemy lines, 15th Air Force Commander coordinated with the Office of Strategic Services to devise a plan to rescue the airmen. And so what they came up with was called Aircrew Rescue Unit. So Aircrew Rescue Unit 1 was the Halyard mission, was what became known as the Halyard mission. And what they did is they had OSS officers that were of Serbian descent, Americans of Serb descent, that had the language capability, some knowledge of the culture, of course, and they used those officers to act as liaison between General Mihailović, who was the royalist commander, the commander of the army in the homeland, which was also known as the Chetniks. Then there was also a mission to General Tito, and Tito, of course, was the partisan, the communist forces. So we sent 2 missions in to coordinate with both of them, and the majority of those that coordinated were of Serbian descent.
Yeah, that's incredibly fortunate that the OSS could call on so many people with so many language capabilities that they could drop right in without any need of translator or language school or anything like that. So all 3 were native speakers then, and were born and raised in that area.
So they were all born in the United States. They were born in the United States, first generation, but they grew up speaking Serbian. Some of them had been to Serbia and studied. They were able to operate within the environment, knowing a little bit about the culture, of course, knowing the language, and that was, of course, a great benefit, as you say.
Well, yeah, tremendous advantage, no question. Besides the language skills, was there anything else that they brought to the table that made them stand out, or were these just the 3 best native speakers that they could find?
Well, I mean, I often wonder how we did anything without automation, without computers, without cell phones, right? But a lot of the recruitment and the use and training was done in some ways serendipitously. I mean, as an example, George Vojinović, during the beginning of the war, he was in Belgrade. So he was there studying to be a medical student. He got caught there. His story is an amazing story, how he ended up getting out of Serbia under German occupation. But while he was escaping, while he was leaving Serbia, he came in contact with officers that were flying supply routes through Africa. They understood that he had this language capability, that he had this capability to talk his way out of situations, and they referred him to the Office of Strategic Services. He showed up and he was recruited to become an operator. So that's just one example.
Wow, right man in the right place at the right time, huh?
Yes, yes. Those language skills, those culture skills played a big part. Of course, they went through all of the important training for the Office of Strategic Services, intelligence gathering, sabotage, hand-to-hand combat. All of those things were requirements because it was the intelligence and special operations arm of the U.S. military.
Mm-hmm. So they only had a few guys, like you mentioned, dropping. It wasn't a big force dropping in or anything like that. What was the situation like on the ground? Like, how heavy was the German presence there on the ground, and how likely were they to actually be able to pull this off?
So the German presence in Serbia was substantial. However, the region where the airmen were being protected, the Germans didn't have great access because it's a very, very hilly region. I won't say mountainous, but it's called Ravnogora, Šumadija region of Serbia, of central Serbia. And the hills provided a natural protection. So the Germans had a very difficult time of accessing that area. And when they did, the General Mihailović's forces, the Royalist forces, were able to ambush them. So they had an area that was protected by about 8,000 Serbian troops. So as soon as they gathered the airmen wherever they might have fell, they brought them to this region where they were protected and cared for.
Okay. So Mihailović, then, he was able to. I mean, he had the muscle on the ground, right? Like he could make things happen. And the OSS guys, were they mostly directing and liaising and that sort of thing?
So the OSS mission consisted of 3 individuals. So you had the first aircrew rescue unit was led by George Muslin. He was the leader, an American of Serb descent. And then you had Michael Rajic also, and then Arthur Jabilian was the radio operator. He was a naval seaman, and he was the radio operator. And so the 3 of them parachuted in, and they were the liaison. They were the coordination team to work with General Mihailović and his forces to help continue to protect and care for the airmen, build a runway on top of one of these hills, and then coordinate the aircraft that came to rescue them over the course of 5 months.
Wow, build a runway on the hill, in the hills, you said?
Yes. So they found, and this was why this area was selected, this village, just outside the village of Planjani, there's a hilltop that was fairly flat, and it allowed for the C-47 aircraft to be able to land there. And now it still was canted a little bit, but it was about the flattest place. And I've traveled through this region frequently, and I can tell you that it is really one of the only options in that region. So they were able to kind of smooth it out, reinforce it with stone so that the aircraft wouldn't necessarily sink into the dirt. And they worked on it together, the OSS with the Serbian army in the homeland, as they were called, the Chetnik forces, and civilians that assisted them. So they worked to smooth out an area that C-47 aircraft could land on.
My gosh, that must have been a big project, building an entire airstrip in a country that's occupied by the Germans, who are, as you said, brutal and repressive. I'm surprised that they were able to keep that under wraps.
So that's an interesting point. So when we think about, building an airstrip, it's something that's super visible, right? This was a remote improvised airstrip. So it was, again, just kind of smoothing out the field. They didn't have big markings because they didn't want to draw attention. The German garrison was probably 40 kilometers away. And so they had aircraft patrolling that area, which makes it even more amazing. They had aircraft, because they weren't detected, they had aircraft patrolling that area. So they would hear the aircraft drone, they would get off the field if they were working and hide in the tree line. A couple of the airmen told me a story that they were waiting, and they just all ran. They heard an airplane, they ran into the bushes, into the tree line, thinking for sure they would be spotted. And then at that moment, a few cows wandered into the field, into the middle of the field, and the German aircraft just kind of circled and then left, thinking it was just thinking it was a pasture. So we were smart, but we were also lucky.
Yeah. So a herd of wandering cows may have saved the entire mission then?
Yeah, exactly.
That's incredible. Incredible. So you mentioned that Mihailović had around 8,000 troops. Was there any active fighting? Were they doing sabotage operations or raids or anything like that at the time? Any reason for the Germans to enter this area?
So, yes, actually. This is a very little known fact, and this is why telling this story is so important. General Mihailović was recognized as the first resistance movement in Europe. So if you look at 1942, he was on the cover of Time magazine. 1942, he was recognized by the United States as being he was the first resistance movement in Europe. And he was giving the Germans a little bit of a hard time there. They had to divert a lot of resources to try to prevent him from continuing to take action. It wasn't until Operation Barbarossa, when the Soviets entered on the Allied side, that Tito came into play. Before that, General Mihailović was the only resistance movement in the Balkans. Once Tito came onto the scene, things got rather complicated because Tito was a communist. He was supported by communist government, and General Mihailović was a royalist. He wanted to see a monarchy reestablished in Serbia, and he was vehemently anti-communist. So they were fighting each other almost as much as they were fighting the Germans and the Axis powers. Initially, Mihailović was very active, but he started to see that his actions had consequences on the local population. And as we discussed, they were negative consequences. So he started to communicate to the Allies that he wanted to husband his resources. He understood that, or there was an understanding at the time, that there might be an invasion of the Balkans from Italy. There was real discussion about that. He communicated that what he wanted to do was husband his resources. As soon as the Allies attacked into the Balkans, he would rise up violently and support in that way. Tito had a different approach. He wasn't so concerned about the effect that had on the civilian population. They had a much different approach. And this is where things got complicated.
Well, I can imagine. Two groups, I guess I call them indigenous groups, fighting the same enemy, but for very different reasons and hoping for a very different outcome at the end of the war. I can see that would lead to a tremendous amount of friction. So were they violently attacking each other, or was it like friction between the two groups?
No, they were actively fighting each other, almost as much as they were fighting the German forces, the Axis forces. And then to add to the complicated nature of this situation, you have, of course, there were the Italians that were also occupying Montenegro, parts of Albania, and then you had other forces within Bosnia, ethnic forces, the Bosniak forces, and you had then Croatian forces. And the ethnic conflict among those three was also complicated the situation. So oftentimes the side you selected wasn't ideological as much as it was protecting your village and your family from whomever was going to attack. So it was an extremely complicated situation in the Balkans at the time.
Wow. And amidst all of that fighting, they've got to try to pull off this undetected rescue mission with hundreds of these guys being protected by thousands of relatively innocent villagers there. It sounds like an almost impossible task. I can't believe they pulled it off.
Well, it was complex. All during this time period, General Mihailović and his forces remained committed to assisting the Americans. Even when the Allied support started to shift away from him towards Tito, he still remained committed, which I think is a testament to his humanity, number one, but to his commitment and honor as a military officer.
Absolutely. Yeah, he sounds like quite a guy. I hadn't heard of him before this, but I'm definitely going to have to read up more on him now. Sounds like a really impressive individual.
Well, yeah, of course, there's a reason why we haven't heard about him, and that's one of the reasons the Halyard Mission Foundation exists, is to tell the real history of the rescue mission, which includes General Mihailović's role. But of course, we know what happened after the war. Tito won. Tito became the president, the dictator of Yugoslavia, and he executed General Mihailović.
Mm-hmm.
And he repressed the story. He repressed it vigorously. So this is one of the major reasons why we have not heard of this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, all of Eastern Europe's problems were far from over at the end of World War II. That's for certain. It's just so many tragedies played out.
That's right. That's correct. And the Balkans was certainly one that was a complicated situation, and it was not an ideal result after the war.
No, it wasn't. So we've already talked about all the problems on the ground with the groups butting heads and fighting and everything, but there was also some friction between the U.S. and the British government just to get this mission off the ground, wasn't there?
There was a bit. And look, I recently saw a documentary about Eisenhower and the planning of the Normandy invasion. And there was tension between him and Montgomery, so there was this kind of natural tension between the Allies. In the Balkans, it was not necessarily different. The British had been on the ground longer, so their presence was more mature. They had established relationships and eyes on the ground before the United States. So they wanted to maintain that decision-making primacy, if you will. The Americans were really focused on preparing for the invasion of Normandy, of fighting in Italy, which was occurring simultaneously after the operations in North Africa. And so we kind of ceded the Balkan space, to the Brits initially. General Donovan, the commander of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, understood our shortfall in the Balkans. He wanted to increase the American presence, and that was also the impetus behind sending OSS missions into the Balkans, so that we would have our own eyes on the situation, and we would be able to make our own decisions. And in some cases, that rubbed the other allies the wrong way.
Right. That makes sense. So, but there weren't any special operations executive personnel. There weren't any British on the ground during this mission, was there? Or they have a separate line of effort or anything like that?
They had separate liaisons with both General Mihailović and Tito. They had separate lines of communication, and they had separate missions initially. And then we attached to those missions. We sent liaisons to kind of get a sense, and then we sent our own mission under the auspices of own and separate mission under the auspices of rescuing the American airmen. The British mission left General Mihailović in May of 1944, so a few months before our mission entered. So they had started to pull support away from General Mihailović. They pulled out their mission from him, and on the same field, actually, they extricated about 50 British and American airmen. So it was kind of a precursor to Operation Halyard, if you will. It happened in May, rescue of a few airmen and the pulling out of the mission. But we then understood that it was even more important to have U.S. personnel on the ground. And again, that caused a little bit of continued friction, because Churchill wanted to stop the support of General Mihailović and increase the support for Tito. Initially, we were supporting both resistance movements. The Allies were supporting both.
Okay.
But then that shifted for a number of reasons.
I see. Well, what about the influence of this guy in the British government, this Soviet agent of influence? I've read a little bit about him, but I don't know much. James Klugman, I know that he was kind of involved from a distance in this, wasn't he?
So this is actually one of the reasons why Allied support shifted away from General Mihailović towards Tito, is because the British intelligence was infiltrated by Soviet spies. And Klugman was one of them. As we've come to understand, his role was pretty significant. In 1942, he served in the SOE in the Yugoslav section as an intelligence officer. He became kind of critical he became critical of the Serb royalist forces of General Mihailović. He sent messages back. He sent intelligence back to London, criticizing General Mihailović, falsifying information. Actually, for many of General Mihailovic's exploits, the credit was given to Tito. And the message was that General Mihailović isn't fighting. He's not fighting as much, but look, Tito is. And that started to shift. The move was to argue for the shift in support from Mihailović to Tito, who was a communist. Now, you may have heard of the Cambridge Five, right? This is what we know more about, this spy ring of 5 individuals. It was Guy Burgess, Donald McLean, Anthony Blunt, Kim Philby, and John Cairncross. There's a lot of information about the role that they played in subverting British intelligence with communist information. You could say that Klugman was kind of the 6th individual, and he played, again, a significant role in changing the Allied support from Mihailović to Tito. And it wasn't until later that we found this out. I saw documents dated in 1997. Until That's when we really had the full understanding of what Klugman was doing and the influence that he had, specifically on this change. The other gentleman had influence across a wider spectrum, but Klugman really influenced our shift from supporting Mihailović.
And it makes you wonder what it would have been like if Mihailović had risen to power in place of Tito. I mean, do you think that did this make or break the support for Mihailović or the shift to Tito? Was he that influential, or was this just one of many factors that eventually led to Tito's rise to power?
Yeah, I would argue, from what I know now, I would argue that was the main factor. Because look, you had Churchill, in essence, convince and push Roosevelt to make this shift, right? And why did Churchill make this shift? Is because of the information that he was receiving. He wasn't necessarily a pro-communist guy, right? But he was being fed information that Tito was fighting better and more than Mihailović. And for Churchill, he wanted to win the war. It was purely pragmatic, almost mercenary. Whoever's fighting hard, that's who we're going to support. And he was receiving false and erroneous information from his sources. So he shifted his support from Mihailović to Tito, and he suggested vigorously that the United States do the same. And we did.
Wow, and we see how that played out in the years and decades to come. It's incredible what one inside influence like this guy, this one dedicated communist agent, the massive change that he can affect on an entire continent, really, when you think about it. It's quite amazing.
It is. It is. I mean, you asked the question, of course, we could think about hypotheticals all the time, alternate history, but certainly Yugoslavia would have been much different had Mihailović prevailed and the royal family come back and the monarchy reestablished. That would have been very much against the Soviet wishes. And that was another factor. In the Yalta and Tehran conferences, the leaders of the Allied powers made some serious decisions on what would happen after the war and who would control what. In some respects, Yugoslavia was a chip that Churchill used to placate Stalin. And listen, there's an anecdote that one of Churchill's advisors suggested that his decisions would cause Yugoslavia to fall under Soviet control. And Churchill's response was, "Are you going to live in Yugoslavia?" I mean, that's right. He didn't.
Oh my gosh, that's
Right?
a new one to me. I had not heard that before.
Yeah. However accurate that is, the fact of the matter was that our actions, the Allied actions, were what resulted in Tito winning and becoming the ruler of Yugoslavia.
It's really sad to hear an entire country with such a rich history and so many people supporting the Allied cause, and they're reduced to a post-war bargaining chip there. But I mean, that's what happens when the superpowers are butting heads with each other. I guess that there's a lot of decisions like that are made in rooms all over the world.
Well, I mean, look, this was a function of global security. I'm not excusing it by any means, but they were, as you say, a pawn. They were a chip, and the result was that Yugoslavia ended up. Now the good thing was that they didn't fall behind the Iron Curtain, and that complicated things after the war as well. The brand of communism under Tito was different than behind the Iron Curtain. It was, if you could say, a softer brand. There was more economic liberalism or economic freedom. He didn't accept any political opposition, but Yugoslavs were able to travel. They were able to work abroad, whereas behind the Iron Curtain in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, they were restricted.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
So it was a different. Yeah, it was a different brand of communism, but Tito used that to play the East off from the West, right? He used that to play the Soviets off against the NATO allies in the United States, and that's another reason why this story didn't come to light for so long, is that we didn't want to antagonize Tito, right? We didn't want to talk about this important mission for fear of pushing Tito closer to the Soviets, which would have affected the geopolitical situation in the Balkans, potentially then affecting Greece and other countries around. So we were very reluctant to antagonize him in any way.
Yeah, it's coldly logical. Certainly, it makes sense, but it's still kind of sad to hear about the real cost there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they were a victim of geopolitical circumstances, which you could look at the history of the Balkans and find many other examples.
Right,
of that.
right. Doesn't necessarily stand out among the rest of their history, tragically.
Yeah.
Well, before we go on, I want to let all of you know about a new educational tool you're not going to want to miss. It's the Gray Man Briefing Classified. By now, I think I know my listeners pretty well, and take it from me, this briefing is exactly the news and educational reference source that you've been looking for. You'll get breaking news updates from all over the world on topics including planned protests and riots, low-intensity conflicts, natural disaster alerts, cyber attacks, supply chain disruptions, and more. You'll also get access to articles that help you build your own skills, including urban survival, home security, counter-surveillance, escape and evasion techniques, and more. And this is much more than just a newsletter in your inbox. Joining the Gray Man Briefing Classified also includes invitation-only channels on the Telegram and Signal apps for convenient real-time updates. The newsletter subscription is normally $5 per month, but if you use the code GBCSpycraft, you can save 20% each month for the life of your subscription. I'm already a member myself and have been reading and learning a lot since I first subscribed. Look it up yourself at graymanbriefing.com. That's gray with an A, graymanbriefing.com, and use the discount code GBCSpycraft to save 20% right from the start. So, John, once Operation Halyard actually began, I know that they built this airstrip. How long did that take, and how quickly were they able to start shuttling these down airmen back to safety?
So the process happened rather quickly. The coordination took place over a couple months. Actually, Muslin, he parachuted in October of 43. He left in May of 44, and then reparachuted in with his team, the Halyard mission team, on the night of August, I think it was 2nd and 3rd of 1944. And the first missions took place on August 9th and 10th. So within a week, they had coordinated everything, finalized the airfield, and started to fly missions.
Wow. Did these guys have to do any, I guess I call it like rudimentary air traffic control? Like, were they guiding the planes in, or did they have partisans doing that?
So interestingly enough, again, I always amazed at how we accomplished this without a single loss and without being detected. They used the very rudimentary navigation capabilities, dead reckoning, course and timing to get to where they were. They had some radio signals. They had a radio operator, as I said. Arthur Jubilian was there initially. And then the first landings were done at night. So they lit fires. They lit some hay fires along the sides of the runway to indicate where the pilots should land. So it was very rudimentary process, but very successful.
Yeah, it worked. That's amazing. And you said, there were hundreds of airmen. How quickly were they able to get these guys out? It must have been a lot of flights to get so many people out, right?
So it was, and because of the size of the runway, it wasn't a prepared surface. It wasn't a really long runway. The aircraft, the C-47 aircraft, which was used to fly the airmen out, which could carry a much bigger load, they were only taking about 12 airmen at a time. given the weight restriction.
Oh, wow.
So of course it took much longer. And Operation Halyard took place over the course of 5 months, from August 9th, 10th of 1944 till December 27th, 1944. And it took place over 3 different locations, because as the Germans were retreating, the Soviets were pushing, General Mihailović also had to retreat. As they retreated and as they moved, they established a total of 3 temporary airstrips to rescue the airmen. Now, the first missions, again, started the night of August 9th and 10th, and over the course of that week is when they extricated the majority of the airmen. So about 200 of the airmen were rescued during the first portion of Operation Halyard. And then subsequent flights took place in September, November, and December in the other 2 airfields.
That's incredible. I mean, that seems like you talked about the heavy losses over the Ploesti airfield. They're flying these planes in for weeks at a time, and they're only getting out 12 guys each flight. That must have been very just anxiety inducing, I guess is the best way to put it.
Well, it was. I mean, look, there's a few factors, I think, that led to the success. I mean, very good planning, pre-planning for the operation. We used fighter escorts and fighter aircraft to cause diversions. So the fighters that would escort the C-47s would go attack an airfield 50 kilometers away, which, again, diverted the attention of the Germans, diverted the attention of their fighter aircraft, and which allowed the 70 American C-47s to land undetected.
Wow. And I'm assuming, I don't think you mentioned it, but some of these airmen, they must have been in hiding for, I guess, months, right, before this happened. So did they bond with the people that were protecting them, or were they shuffled around to a bunch of different houses, or what exactly? Was it like, some tearful goodbyes there when they left?
So they were kept on the move. They were kept on the move to stay ahead of the German forces, to keep the Germans guessing and not knowing where the Americans. I just spent 2 days ago, had the opportunity to meet one of the last surviving airmen, Tony Orsini. He's 99 years old. He's going to be 100 years old next year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he told me how he was there for 39 days, 37 or 39 days. So that was one of the longer stays, if you will. He was shot down on his first flight over Ploesti, his first mission. And he spent 30 some odd days evading, being moved periodically from place to place, house to house, barn to barn. So the other part of your question, whether some emotions and some cheerful goodbyes, look, we had a chance to interview a number of the airmen that were still living in 2009. It was a real honor to have the opportunity to spend some time with those gentlemen. And every single one of them became emotional when they talked about the care and treatment they received from the Serbians, and how hard it was to say goodbye and not be able to thank them appropriately. And then, as you can imagine, not being able to thank them after the war, because it was very difficult to communicate with a communist-led country. The airmen left whatever they could. Tony told me he left his gun, he left his watch, he left a bunch of different things. A lot of the airmen left their shoes, to people. There's another very interesting story. There was one Tuskegee airman that was shot down. He was an escort pilot, and he was shot down. So he was one of the 500 American airmen that was rescued. And as you might imagine, an African-American airman was not only rare in our Air Force, but it was a very rare sight in the Balkans. And so they took care. They assigned an individual, a young boy, to make sure that he had what he needed, and he was escorted from place to place. And that young boy actually is still alive. And we see him at our ceremonies in Serbia. And when Captain Robert Walker was the Tuskegee Airman, when he was leaving, he gave his boots to this little boy. So the gentleman now, as you can imagine, he's in his late 80s. He tells that story in a very emotional and very compelling way. He doesn't have the boots anymore. but we gave him a new pair.
In the last 80 years, yeah.
Yeah, but we gave him a new pair. So.
That's wonderful. I wonder, you mentioned the watch, giving away the watch. I have to wonder if that watch is still on somebody's wrist or in somebody's home, something like that, even all these years later.
So that's something actually we're trying to understand. One of the goals of the foundation is to connect with all of the airmen and their families. There's very few. I'm only aware of 2 that are alive. If anybody listening knows any others, that would be amazing to find. But I know that there's 2 airmen that are still alive. it's very heartening and important that the families are still involved in telling the story, and everyone that we've connected with has been very eager to be involved in telling the story and the importance that the Serbian people played in helping rescue their fathers and grandfathers.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm so glad that I've had the opportunity to connect with you and learn about this myself and help other people learn about it as well. So I'm hopeful that we can stay connected after this and share this story far and wide, because it really is incredible. And hopefully you can find some more of those airmen. I would hope that there's more than 2 that are still with us.
Yeah, I hope so too. And we're eager to find out. But again, we've instituted kind of this program, Finding 500. So we're trying to find all of the families, if possible, and connect with them, and then connect them with the Serb families that helped rescue the Americans. As you can imagine, you asked about whether there's artifacts still floating around. There's a number of the airmen that received gifts as well, received daggers, other items from Serbs, and being able to catalog those things, photograph those things, archive the documents that they may have is really important. As is, we've made some connections with a number of museums in the United States that are also very interested in telling this story. So our ability to show the story in a compelling way, which includes, of course, great photographs and artifacts, helps to teach Americans about this important part of World War II history.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. It's fascinating stuff. So, John, we already mentioned kind of that the mission was kept quiet over Tito's rise to power afterwards. What happened to the OSS guys themselves? Did they continue on? I mean, the war ended and they must have left the service, I'm guessing. Do you have any information on what they went on to after that?
So the great results of our work is we're very close to the families of 3 of the major OSS officers. So George Voinovich, George Muslin, and Nick Lalic were the 3 OSS officers of Serbian descent who were close with their families now. Unfortunately, they've all passed. But it's a great privilege to have learned more about them and what they did afterwards. As an example, George Muslin entered the CIA afterwards. He served a career in intelligence after World War II, and we were able to learn a number of things about what these gentlemen did afterwards. And we produced actually 3 short animations that kind of tell the story of their lives.
Huh. I haven't seen that. I'll have to look at that, certainly. Is it on the site?
It is. It's on our website. I'm happy
to
share that with you.
Good. Yeah, I'll have to look that up. We can probably link that up. We'll certainly link up your website in the show notes and everything after that. I've been to the website, but I haven't seen those videos yet, so I'll have to look for them. I guess in the aftermath, all these guys went home to their family. Like you mentioned, it was 100% success rate. Like they didn't lose anybody that they actually got from the ground. Were there any reunions or anything like that prior to the start of your foundation that you're aware of?
So that's a good question. Many of the groups, like the bomb groups, soon after the war, they formed alumni associations. So you had the 449th Bomb Group Association, and the airmen would get together annually to tell war stories and commiserate. But as you might imagine, the number of airmen has decreased, but families are still very much involved. Now that's bomb groups. In terms of the Halyard, the airmen that were rescued by General Mihailović, immediately after the war, they made an effort to testify at General Mihailović's trial. So immediately afterwards, they petitioned Congress, they petitioned their lawmakers to tell the truth, but they were rebuffed. Of course, Tito never, or the Yugoslavs never accepted this testimony, and General Mihailović was soon executed. But the airmen, it wasn't so much reunions, but a number of them gathered to try to rehabilitate the name of General Mihailović, to try to honor him. As an example, Charles Davis there was the Organization of American Airmen to Rescue and Rehabilitate General Mihailović. It was a really long moniker for the organization. But each decade, they would attempt to tell the story, to try to honor him, to erect a monument of some sort. And each decade they made small progress, but were always rebuffed because somebody in government, like I said, the State Department or whomever, pushed back because they didn't want to antagonize Tito over a historic story. So many of them tried to do what they could to honor what was done on their behalf, but were never able to do so. In 2006, a group of the airmen, this was the year before I arrived in Serbia, a group of the airmen went to visit Serbia and went to visit the airfield. There was a group of them, and they also provided General Mihailović's daughter the award that President Truman awarded to General Mihailović posthumously. He awarded him the Legion of Merit for the role that he played in the rescue of American airmen, which again, is the highest award that we could provide to a foreign military officer. So he received the Legion of Merit, but it wasn't given to his family. It wasn't given to his daughter until 2006.
My gosh, it's incredible. That must have been such a, I guess to say, like a cathartic trip for those guys to go back to the airfield 60 years afterwards. What a journey.
Yeah, it was the culmination, but still it wasn't enough in their minds. I had the chance again to speak to many of them. As emotional as they are about the rescue, they're also emotional about the fact that they weren't able to make progress, to tell the story the way it should be told. And quite frankly, that's why I'm committed to doing what we're doing, because it's not just a nice story. It's not just a good thing to do. It's my responsibility to do what they couldn't do. It's absolutely our responsibility to tell the story because they couldn't do it. And so I'm not, particularly great for doing this. I'm standing on their shoulders, and I think that's an important thing to do.
That's tremendous. Yeah, I'm so glad that you're able to get that story out, because I wouldn't have known much about it until I found the Halyard Foundation myself. And now who you are, and you're, hopefully through this medium and through others as well, you'll be able to get it out to a much wider audience as well. So, John, what are the foundation's goals at the moment? I know that you mentioned you're trying to find any more surviving airmen, but what else do you have on the horizon for the foundation?
So we've got a couple of different things. We're going through a transition period to make the foundation a sustainable organization, because to do this, we need to commit. Right now, we're doing this with a great amount of passion, a great amount of volunteerism, but I want to take this to a higher level. I think this story needs to be told in a manner that really values what occurred. And to do that, we need to be sustainable. So that means having a sustainable level of commitment and investment to do this. We're in this kind of growth period of this transition period, but specifically some of the projects we're working on, for me, it's about the people and the places. So as I mentioned, working to find all of the families, connect them with Serb families. And then also we've established a historic trail in Serbia. We put historic markers in places that are historically significant to the rescue mission, where aircraft were down, where airmen were kept, and use those placards to tell the individual stories of the people that were at those locations. So we're doing a tremendous amount of research, and right now we have got about 24 historic markers around Serbia that connect, again, these locations. You could walk the trail or drive the trail of an airman that might have been shot down near Zlatibor, but was evacuated from Pranjani. So these are two of the things that we're focused on. We hold an annual ceremony each September, the third Saturday in September, on the field where the rescue mission took place. We recently completed a permanent memorial there. So on the field where the rescue mission took place, there's a permanent memorial site and an operating sport airfield. So we were able to reestablish a sport airfield on that. So 78 years after, we could fly aircraft there again.
Huh. That's fantastic. Wow, it sounds like you've got a lot going on then.
We do, and we have a lot more to do.
Wonderful, wonderful. So what's the website one more time for people who listen to this and they want to learn more?
Sure, it's www.halyardmission.org. So it's HALYARD mission.org.
All right. Well, thank you, John. This has been really informative, and I want to stay in contact with you. I hope I certainly get the chance to go to Serbia and see some of those markers and walk the same ground as those guys one day, if possible.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. You're certainly invited. And if anybody else is interested in seeing where the airmen were rescued, feel free to contact, and we'd love to see you in September.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely hope that happens. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101 and at cold.war.stamps, or connect with me on Patreon. My patrons get exclusive access to long-form blog posts that dive deep into some of the most amazing stories in the history of espionage and receive free or discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. That includes free PDF copies of my own books, Spy Shots Volume 1, 101 True Tales from the World of Espionage, and Covert Arms, Weapons from the World of Spycraft and Espionage. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons, including Jack T. and William M. With your support, I've been able to continue funding my research and publication across multiple platforms to date. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Thanks for listening to this program brought to you by Daydreamer Network. If you enjoyed the episode, please don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred platform. Your feedback allows us to rank on the best new shows list and continue to grow our podcasts in order to bring more unique and talented storytellers to the network. To check out our shows, including programs about relationships, sports, business, nutrition, leisure, and more, head to www.daydreamernetwork.com. We look forward to seeing you back next week for another great episode. Have a wonderful day.